It's so good to see you all on this snowy, cold day. But I'm thinking, to me, this Bible study, it's like potato soup on a warm day or on a cold day when it's just comforting. If you would join me in prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us together, for just to have this opportunity to gather openly and read your word and discuss it. What a blessing, and we are so grateful. Give us the wisdom today to see and hear what it is you want us to know about this crucial time in Jesus' life. In your precious name we pray. Amen.
Becky, would you keep your eye on that to make sure?
I will.
Okay.
I will. Okay, so we're going to start, and I forget which number it is, but this is the trial before Herod Antipas and the second mockery. So we're going to be in Luke 23 ultimately. But I do want to remind you, back in Mark, and I think Mark does the best job of describing it. If you remember, back in Mark, and chapter 6 is like the rest of the story, if you will. But I think it was in chapter 5, when Herod had John the Baptist arrested. And then he had that big feast, and he was impressed by his stepdaughter Salome entertaining everybody, and he makes that promise, I'll give you half my kingdom, what is it that you want? And she says the head of John the Baptist on a platter, and he gives in to her and does that. And I'll read to you Mark 6. You guys stay in Luke, but Mark 6, just for context, after John the Baptist was beheaded, that's when Jesus became notorious. How do I want to say it? The public really became more aware of him. It's like John the Baptist was that prophet that he had to go for Jesus to really be lifted up and people to know who he was. So this happens, and in verse 14 of Mark 6, and King Herod heard of it, for his name had become well known, and people were saying, John the Baptist has risen from the dead, and that is why these miraculous powers are at work in him, meaning Jesus. But others were saying, he is Elijah, and others were saying, he is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he kept saying, John, who I have beheaded, has risen. So that's who Herod thought Jesus was. And he was curious to meet him, to find that out, because I think historical records show that Herod had a lot of discussion with John the Baptist, and John didn't back down. He was criticizing him for his marriage to Herodias, because that was his niece. I mean, I'm not going to go into all that, but it was disgusting. And John was telling this governor of that area, you are wrong, and you are living in a sinful, ungodly manner. He did it, regardless of how powerful Herod was. John was stood up to him. And so this happened, and Herod felt great regret. So he was curious about Jesus, and that's going to come in to this. Having said that, let's go to Luke, and I'm going to read from chapter 23, verses 6 through 12. When Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself was in Jerusalem at that time. Now, on your map, there should be a place, one of the arrows leads to it, where it's Herod's palace. Do you see it, Diane? And can you give me a direction?
The lower palace, the royal palace.
Down
Yes.
in the middle of it.
Left-hand
So it's a blue box if you're giving one of the maps that I have, but it's like in between the temple and the city gates. So it's like, it's in between there. That's where, now Herod is like governor of Galilee. And if you remember, Galilee is the area where Jesus' headquarters was, that north of Jerusalem. But he had headquarters in Jerusalem, in the city. So when he needed to come into the city, he had a place to stay. That's where we're talking about. That's where they send Jesus. This is verse 8. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently. And Herod with his soldiers after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before they had been enemies with each other. All right, let's dig in. Herod Antipas was the 7th and youngest son of Herod the Great. He was born prior to 20 BC, and upon the death of his father, became the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. Remember, that's north of Jerusalem, which he ruled for some 43 years. Like his father, he carried on ambitious building projects, including the cities of Sepphoris and Tiberias. Tiberias is right on the Sea of Galilee. However, he lacked Herod the Great's ability to rule, and so it is not without cause that upon hearing of the tetrarch's plot against him, Jesus referred to Antipas as that fox. That was back in Luke 13. About a year before the trial, Herod Antipas had beheaded John the Baptist. Only then did he begin to hear about Jesus' miracles and, for a while, thought that Jesus was John raised from the dead. He had wanted to meet him in person of a long time. Pilate now sent Jesus, a Galilean, to Herod Antipas because he was under Antipas's jurisdiction. So Antipas finally got his wish. Jesus stood before him, and he wanted to see miracles and be entertained. This same desire had cost John his life. However, Jesus refused to perform for Antipas because miracles were never for the purpose of entertainment. Disappointed, Antipas mocked Jesus by arraying him in gorgeous apparel. The second mockery the Messiah suffered that night. In Greek, gorgeous apparel is aestheta lampran. The term does not allow us to speculate whether the garments were white, making Jesus a king designate, or purple, which would have been the regal garb. However, the way the words are used in Acts 12:21 and James 2:3, the more likely meaning is regal clothing. Even Herod Antipas acknowledged that Jesus posed no threat to Rome, regardless of the accusations brought against him by the chief priests and scribes. So this trial concluded with a second declaration of innocence. Luke observed, and Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before they were at enmity between themselves. The hostility between the two rulers had started when, as the newly appointed procurator, Pilate ordered his legions to carry ensigns with Caesar's portrait into Jerusalem. This violated Jewish law, which forbade the making of images. The offensive military standards which Pilate carried into Jerusalem were not the eagles of the legions. This, indeed, was impossible because Pilate had no legionary troops. Figures of the emperor, however, were carried, not only by the legions, but also by the auxiliary troops. That's from Schurer, that author. But you notice that second line, figures of the emperor, however, were carried not only by legions, so figures of the emperor. In Jerusalem, they were bringing in another king, right? And the Jews were, that was frowned upon. You don't bring that into the temple area. That's their area. Herod Antipas, a nominal convert to Judaism, understood these Jewish sensitivities. He knew that as long as the ensigns were within the walls of Jerusalem, a constant threat existed of Jewish agitation turning into rebellion. He asked Pilate to take them down, but Pilate refused. Then Antipas wrote a letter of complaint to the Roman Senate, who ordered Pilate to comply. Pilate and Antipas were at enmity between themselves because each felt that the other did not recognize his authority. Now that the ruler of Judea had sent a Galilean to the one in charge of Galilee, they recognized their mutual authority and became friends at Jesus' expense. You know, and isn't that how it all goes? We're just authorities. I want to one up the other. I'm more powerful than you, and I'll prove it by acting ridiculous and stupid, right? Herod Antipas and his wife Herodias eventually paid for beheading John and mocking Jesus. In the year AD 39, so this is after the crucifixion, in the year AD 39, Herodias prompted her husband to go to Rome, listen to this, to request the title of king. The Senate had given that title to his father, Herod the Great, and if Rome also made Antipas king of Judea, she could be called queen. The emperor at the time was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, better known by his childhood nickname Caligula, meaning little boots. He was in power for only 4 years, but it was a bloody reign, for Caligula was mad, meaning insane. His excesses knew no bounds. Whenever he exhausted the government treasury to pay for his personal expenditures, does that sound familiar? He accused a wealthy landowner or senate of some crime, killed the whole family, and seized their property. Nothing has changed, right? Eventually, the situation worsened so that the Praetorian Guard, so this is the Romans guard that protected this Jew, the Jewish leader, once his protector, assassinated him. When Antipas and Herodias came before Caligula to request the title of king and queen, he banished them to Lyon, and that's Lyon in France, where they died in abject poverty. Here's an extra source. When Caligula became emperor in the year 37, he gave to his friend Agrippa, Herodias' brother, both the territory that had until 3 years earlier been ruled by Philip the Tetrarch and the title of king. Herodias persuaded Antipas to request the same title from the emperor. However, Agrippa proceeded to bring charges against Antipas, a plotting insurrection, which resulted in his being exiled to Gaul, modern France, in 39. He was accompanied by Herodias. The Tetrarch failed to clear himself of the charge, and in AD 39 was banished to Lugdunum, probably Saint Bertrand de Comminges, another place in France. That's for sure. Not far from the Spanish frontier. Herodias, either from choice or necessity or despair, accompanied his exile, and here they both died in obscurity and dishonor. And if we're truthful with ourselves, isn't that the ultimate punishment for some ruler, that they're obscure, right? And in dishonor? As to the famous Salome, and I don't know if I should read this or not, tradition holds that after 2 incestuous marriages, she met with a rather bizarre end. For the traditional death of the dancing daughter of Herodias by falling through and have her head cut off by the ice. He reports that passing over a frozen lake, the ice broke and she fell up to the neck in water, and her head was parted from her body. That's how the Lord works, quite honestly. By the violence of the fragments shaken by the water and her own fall, and so perished. And that's from the book Life of Christ by Farrar. The second trial before Pilate. We're still in Luke. Let's continue on, verses 13 through 25. Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. Nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us. And behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. Therefore, I will punish him and release him." Now he was obliged to release to them at the feast one prisoner. But they cried out all together, saying, "Away with this man, and release for us Barabbas." He was the one who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection made in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again. But they kept on calling out, saying, "Crucify, crucify him." And he said to them the third time, "Why? What evil has this man done? I have found in him no guilt demanding death. Therefore I will punish him and release him." But they were insistent, with loud voices asking that he be crucified, and their voices began to prevail. And Pilate pronounced sentence that their demand be granted, and he released the man they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but he delivered Jesus to their will. After Herod Antipas failed to find a charge against Jesus, Pilate made several specific efforts to release Jesus, in the process again declaring his innocence. He gathered the religious leaders and said, "Ye brought unto me this man, as one that perverts the people. And behold, I, having examined him before you, found no fault in this man touching those things whereof ye accuse him. If one wanted to keep a list of declarations of innocence, Herod's statement would be the second and Pilate's the third. However, the crowd rejected these proclamations of Jesus' innocence. Now, I'm going to warn you ahead of time, this Yeshua Bar Abba, you have to really think about this. It's super fascinating. And the first time I read this, I was like, what? I don't get this at all. And it took me, I had to read it a couple, 3 times. But I'll try to explain it as best I can. But it's all in the name. So just be thinking of the name. In his second attempt to free Jesus, Pilate offered the people a choice. A custom had developed that during the Passover, the Roman authorities would release one Jewish prisoner as a goodwill gesture. Besides Jesus, another man named Barabbas was imprisoned, whom John referred to as a robber. A better translation might be malefactor or rebel, since robbery was not punishable by death. Mark clearly stated that Barabbas had made insurrection, and in that insurrection had committed murder. Barabbas was actually guilty of the crime which Jesus was accused. This is reaffirmed by Luke 23, verse 19. In another book, Bach observes, Barabbas was not an outstanding character. Matthew 27:16 calls him a notorious prisoner. John calls him a robber, and Mark notes that he committed murder in the insurrection, similar to Luke. Barabbas led a rebellion of uprising and committed murder, for which he was thrown into prison. Ironically, Barabbas did what Jesus is being convicted of. Jesus suffers on behalf of Barabbas, and thus pictures how he sets sinful captives free. The irony, and this is where we have to pay attention, the irony is the Barabbas, quote unquote, was not a proper name, but a Greek transliteration of the Aramaic words bar, which means son of, and Abba, which was his father's name, making him son of Abba. The Gospels do not give his actual name, probably to avoid confusing the reader. However, other sources reveal that his name was also Yeshua, a common first century name. So 2 men shared the same name. See how God works? One was guilty of sedition, and the other was accused but innocent of sedition. Even more ironic is the fact that Barabbas's father's name was Abba, which in Aramaic means the father. So Barabbas's name and title was Yeshua, the son of the Father. One bore the name and title, but the other was the true Yeshua, the true son of the true Father, which raises an interesting question, and hopefully this clarifies things in your mind. Here we encountered yet another misunderstanding, appearing when a choice is offered between the release of Barabbas and that of Jesus. Barabbas is the Aramaic equivalent for son of the Father. And if one accepts the content of certain manuscripts that Origen was an early church father, read, the given name of Barabbas was Jesus. So both were named Jesus. Which of the two was in the mind of individuals in the crowd when in Aramaic the release was chosen? There does not seem to be any way to decide this question definitively. To say the least, a doubt beclouds the guilt of those who made this incredible choice. The 2 men were brought forward. Pilate tried hard to release Jesus because he perceived that for envy the chief priests had delivered him up. As it was with John the Baptizer, so it would be with Messiah. The actual reasons were personal, but the charge was political. Pilate assumed that the people would ask for Jesus, not Barabbas's release. The trial was temporarily interrupted when Pilate received a message from his wife warning him not to get involved with the situation because of a dream she had just had. By church tradition, her name was Procla, or Claudia Procula, and she later became a believer. The interruption by Pilate's wife was long enough so that the chief priests and the elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Bar Abba, and destroy Yeshua. And that is what they did. But they cried out altogether, saying, Away with this man, and release unto us Bar Abba. And thus Pilate's second attempt to free Jesus also failed. So did you see that? Did you understand that?
I understand it, but still I wonder, did they all know which one they were calling for?
They knew who they were calling for. And it'll come clear later. But I just think there are no coincidences.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, look at how God does this. He puts these two men with the same name up in front of him. And who do you want released? The real criminal or the one that you're accusing? And, the reason, like they said that the priests put him up there because they were jealous of him. So.
I never made the connection that John's death was out of jealousy in this. It just
stacks up.
Yeah.
It just stacks up. And for when Jesus goes in front of Herod Antipas, he just wants, show me a miracle.
Yeah.
Appease my curiosity. Yeah. Okay, are we ready to go on? The chastisement and the third mockery. Pilate made a third attempt to free Jesus by satisfying the bloodlust of the crowd in a different way. Then Pilate therefore took Yeshua and scourged him. Details are omitted from the Gospels because people would have been familiar with this type of punishment. Now, more than 2,000 years later, many do not understand what it means to be scourged, so they miss the degree of Jesus' suffering prior to the cross. To be scourged was to be beaten or flogged with a whip with multiple lashes. The Jews had exact rules regarding this form of punishment. Now, before I go on, do you remember that time I brought that poster with the fence, the Mosaic Law and the fence? The fence were these circles, that these laws that the scribes were adding to add a fence around the law. So like adding more law to the original law so they wouldn't break the original law. That's kind of what's going on here. Okay, the actual stripes given were restricted to 40 save 1, because according to the Mosaic Law, nobody could be lashed more than 40 times. It says that in Deuteronomy 25:3. The Sophirim, so that's that group during the exile in Babylon. They were reviewing these laws and said, we know that we are exiled in Babylon because we sinned against God. We sinned greatly against God. So let's review these laws and figure out a way to teach our people and to make the laws stricter so that we won't break the original one, is essentially what they're doing. So they added these extra things to it. So the Sophirim raised the question, suppose the lasher was lashing, miscounted and gave the victim 41 lashes and broke the law. Therefore, they built a fence around that law by stopping the count at 39 and calling it 40 save 1. So do you see where we're going with this? That's how they tried to mitigate this. The Jewish scourge was made either of leather or wood, for the handle had short leather lashes, but only part of the body beaten was the victim's back. The whipping was excruciating, but never deadly. Paul suffered this Jewish punishment 5 times and survived. And you can read that he describes it in 2 Corinthians 11:24. However, Jesus was flogged by Romans, not Jews, with a vastly different procedure. Under Roman law, the number of times a person could be struck with a scourge was limitless. The Roman whip had long leather lashes which could wrap around the whole body. At the end of each lash was a piece of metal, nail, glass, or sharp lamb bone. Sometimes even small jagged iron balls were used. After only a few applications of the scourge, the skin of the victim was torn away and the muscles exposed. The entire body was afflicted, the front, back, side, and face. The face was lacerated and became like pulp. Paintings of the crucifixion often reveal a faulty interpretation of this scene, portraying Jesus' face intact except for a line of blood on the brow from the crown of thorns. In reality, his face would have been a pulpy mass. By the time a Roman flogging was over, often even family members no longer recognized the victim. This fulfilled the specific messianic prophecy of Isaiah 52:14, which said that the Messiah's face was so disfigured that he no longer resembled a man. Then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him, like the crucifixion itself, where the scriptures are silent except for the words, "They crucified him." So here, a veil is drawn over this scene and is done purposefully. We should therefore be content with only a few comments and then move on. The scourging and mocking by the soldiers takes place within the palace itself and was not seen by the people. After it was all over, Pilate brings Jesus back before the crowd, and they see him for the first time in this condition. The victim was stripped and usually tied to a post with his hands also bound, so as not to be able to defend himself. The punishment by scourging was so severe that the victim usually fainted and not rarely died. Pilate had a reason for the severity of this flogging. He was seeking to present Jesus Christ to the crowd once again and hoped that the severity of his sufferings would suffice. The very fact that later on Jesus Christ is unable to carry his cross is another indication of the suffering he previously encountered. It is not a case that the Lord would not carry his cross. He could not carry his cross, and the soldiers knew it, and knew why this was the case. This was the fourth mistreatment Jesus endured on that night, and he also suffered the third mockery. The accusation was that he claimed to be a king, so the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and arrayed him in a purple garment, a sign of royalty, thus mocking Jesus. The thorns of some plants in Israel come to almost razor-sharp points, so that even lightly brushing against one can cause bleeding. Merely placing it on Jesus' head after his scourging would cause pain, but they kept striking him. If they struck him on the head where the crown rested, the thorns would cut deeper and more painfully. The symbolism is important. Thorns symbolize the Adamic curse back in Genesis 3:18. Therefore, by means of his suffering, Jesus bore upon himself the Adamic curse. Pilate, believing that this severe corporal punishment without a guilty verdict would satisfy the Jewish leadership, issued a fourth declaration of innocence. However, although the crowd saw that Jesus was beaten to a bloody mess, they still cried out for his crucifixion. A new charge. Pilate made a fourth attempt to free Jesus by again declaring him innocent of any crime. Without a sentence by Rome, he could not be executed. At this point, the Jewish leaders dropped the charge of sedition and returned to the real issue troubling them all along. Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. We have a law, and by that law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Since Pilate had a new charge, he had to conduct a new interrogation. This time, Jesus did not answer any of his questions, probably because Pilate had previously received sufficient light to respond correctly, but instead asked sarcastically, "What is truth?" Therefore, Jesus gave him no further truth. Pilate, pressing for an answer, pointed out that he had the authority to release Jesus or have him crucified, but Jesus reminded Pilate that his authority was delegated. "You would have no power against me except it were given you from above. Therefore, he that delivered me unto you has the greater sin." Final authority comes from heaven above. Furthermore, those who turned Jesus over to Pilate were guilty of the greater transgression, proving that our varying degrees of sin. The great white throne judgment will judge the works of the unbeliever and determine the appropriate degree of punishment in the lake of fire. So I want to stop here a moment. I just realized as I was going through this, we did not read that scripture in there, and I didn't have that. John 19 through 5 through 6. But I wanted to stop here a moment. That is a very important line where Jesus says, "You would have no power against me except it were given you from above. Therefore, he that delivered me unto you has the greater sin." So he's saying, unless God, Jehovah, didn't want him there, he was going to be there. It was God's will for him to be there. But the people who brought him there are guilty of the greater sin. So you see there's levels of sin that some is considered worse than the other. Now we're not given that list, but just that sentence by Jesus proves that there are some sins that are worse than others. Well, I can say, according to Scripture, the greatest sin, the unpardonable sin, is to not believe in his Son, Jesus Christ. And we're going to go through that even a little bit more. But I just think that that's a huge point. And the great white throne judgment, that's the second judgment. That's for unbelievers. We will have no part in that. It will judge the works of the unbeliever and determine the appropriate degree of punishment in the lake of fire. So their punishment is going to be permanent separation from God. That's horrible anyway, but depending on what they're all guilty of. So can you imagine an unbeliever, how horrible that will be, but to stand and be judged, and then they're going to have to pay for all of that. We, as believers, that's why I say once you're saved, you're always saved. Once you're saved, you're always saved. Once you believe in Jesus Christ as your Redeemer, on that judgment day, he's going to stand in front of you and say, I have already paid for that person's sin. Whereas an unbeliever, you can't save yourself. You can't. So unless you never sin in your life, you're guilty of something against God. You have to stand in front of God and he's going to see your life before, nobody can be perfect. Only Jesus. Make sense? Pilate made a fifth attempt to have Jesus released. Upon this, Pilate sought to release him. However, this effort was spoiled when the people started crying out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone that makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. While sounding like an empty threat, it still intimidated Pilate. When Pilate, therefore, for the specific reason, heard these words, referring to the words, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend, he brought Yeshua out and sat down on the judgment seat. And this is John 19. I'm going to start at John 19:8 and actually read that. Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid, and he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, you do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and I have authority to crucify you? Jesus answered, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, behold, your king. So they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. So then he handed him over to them to be crucified. On your map, this place is, on this one, it's where all the arrows are. Antonia Fortress, it's right outside the Temple Mount. And that, remember when we talked about the priests had to be very careful on Passover not to step into a Gentile house, or one of the other requirements, they couldn't have a dead body in the city. That's why they took care of Judas the way they did. And that was for the Romans. That Antonia place was a court for the Romans, and it was outside the temple, but just outside the temple. That's where this is taking place. Back to the notes. The people's threat intimidated Pilate enough to make him immediately close the proceedings and take his place on the judgment seat, or bema. The bema was an elevated stand probably erected outside the praetorium from where public meetings were directed and courts were held. The Jewish leaders had entered the praetorium. If the Jewish leaders had entered the praetorium, they would have defiled themselves and could not have eaten the shagag, the paschal lamb, later that morning. Therefore, Pilate left the palace to take his seat on the bema and rendered the verdict. If found guilty, the accused would then be sentenced. I'm going to finish out, let's see. I'm in John 19. I'm going to read 13 through 16. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, I already read that. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." So they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him, Pilate." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Can you imagine that? A Jewish leader. We have no king but Caesar. Where do they place God? So then he handed him over to them to be crucified. So letter D, behold your king. Sitting on the bema, Pilate made his 6th and final attempt to release Jesus, presenting him to the people and saying, "Behold your king." The masses, however, countered by demanding his crucifixion. When he asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." That cry came from the chief priest, the Sadducees, who, with this statement, disowned the Messiah as their king and proclaimed their allegiance to Caesar. The Pharisees would not have made such a declaration. Pilate made no further attempts to free Jesus. Instead, taking a pitcher of water, he washed his hands before the multitude, assuming that this gesture would absolve him of guilt, but it did not. From a human perspective, the final decision as to whether Jesus lived or died was not with the Jewish leaders, but with this one man, Pontius Pilate. Roman law prescribed that instigators of a revolt, riot, or agitators of the people were to be either crucified, thrown to wild animals, or banished to an island. The punishment was determined by the perpetrator's position in Roman society. Apparently, Jesus was handed over to Pilate without a verdict, and nowhere in the sources is a verdict by Pilate reported. In the catalogue of the crimes of Pilate, provided by the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, among others, we find constant execution without passing judgment. It would seem, therefore, that Jesus' tragic end was preceded by no verdict of any earthly judiciary. It was the outcome of a grisly interplay of naked spheres of interest in the shadow of brutal antagonisms. To outward appearance, it had no real connection with the man Jesus or his cause. Now, as I read that, I'm thinking, why did I choose to include this in there? I think that instigators of a revolt writer. But the point is, Pilate didn't have a charge against him. It was the mob of people that demanded he be crucified. That's what really did it. But Pilate had the power to say, "I'm not doing this," and he did not. So he's guilty as well. Pilate clearly knew what the right decision was, but he allowed himself to be intimidated into making the wrong one. Merely washing his hands did not absolve him from blame. Later, Peter listed several people by name who were responsible for the Messiah's death, and he included Pontius Pilate. That's in Acts chapter 4. The earliest creed in church history, the Apostles' Creed, states he suffered under Pontius Pilate. God did not absolve Pilate of what he did. In AD 36, Caligula deposed Pilate and banished him to Gaul, where he committed suicide, thereby paying for his role in the miscarriage of his justice. I wonder if he didn't feel extreme guilt after this, knowing what he did. I mean, realizing what he did.
Especially when his wife became a believer.
Yes, yes. Pilate then issued his 5th declaration of innocence, calling Jesus this righteous man. This was the most significant of the 5 attestations because it was made from the judgment seat. Still, all the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and on our children." They took upon themselves the curse of the blood, limiting it to themselves and their children. When the judgments for the unpardonable sin finally came in AD 70, it indeed fell upon them and their children, fulfilling the curse. Matthew alone recorded this response, since he carefully traced the outworking of the unpardonable sin. Finally, Pilate issued the death sentence. While releasing Yeshua Bar Abba, or Barabbas, there was a symbolic substitution in that the innocent one went to his death in place of the guilty one who was set free. Then therefore he, Pilate, delivered him, Yeshua, unto them to be crucified. Who killed Jesus? The question of who killed Jesus comes up often, particularly in Jewish evangelism. For millennia, the Jewish people have been viewed as an incorrigible race of Christ killers. This accusation is usually justified by citing Matthew 27:25, where the people cry out, "His blood be on us and on our children." However, the New Testament does not mention the Jewish people as a unified nation that actively participated in the crucifixion of Jesus. Both the Hebrew Scriptures, meaning Old Testament, and the New Testament clearly show that Jesus had to die in order to save the world from sin. Redemption became necessary when sin entered the human sphere and separated man from God. When Adam and Eve committed that first act of disobedience, their sin separated them from God. God himself then ordained that the only way he could be approached was by blood. This bridging of the gap is called redemption. And the means of redemption was always by a substitutionary blood sacrifice. This is the conclusion of the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, and the final blood sacrifice was to be the Messiah himself. And I'm going to pause there for a moment, because remember when they sinned and God came to them and he asked them what they did, and of course they denied it, denied responsibility, and then they had made garments for themselves out of fig leaves, and this was not acceptable. So God made them garments out of skins, made them garments. So in other words, he had to kill an animal to make them. That was the first sacrifice, so to speak. That's from then on, a sacrifice of blood is the only way. And it's not to forgive sins, it's just simply to cover them. To cover them. But since that point, I just think, and of course, when Adam and Eve sinned, God knew they were going to sin. He knows the end from the beginning. But still, we've talked about on Saturday, those who were able to join us, how God has emotion. And just think when they committed that sin and how he must have been thinking, now I'm going to have my son do this. Knowing that that's eventually going to have to happen. What a horrible letdown that God had given them the commandment, and Satan, barely a tug, was able to convince them, just twisting scripture around. And Adam was just as guilty as Eve, because he should have said, no, this is wrong. When she took the bite and offered it to him. And, when we learned in dispensation, dispensationalism, Adam, in this early part, he was representative of the human race. Had he said no and not eaten it, he wouldn't have been imputed with sin. But since he was, now we have the sin nature. But God knew he was going to do it. And he knew his plan. He knew his plan. Any questions, or am I making it more confusing for you? All right. This is the conclusion of the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, and the final blood sacrifice was to be the Messiah himself. That is why the Messiah had to die according to the Tanakh, or the Old Testament. That is why Jesus did die according to the New Testament. Who killed Jesus was never an issue as far as the New Testament was concerned, for the Messiah had to die in order to save the world from sin. It only became an issue years later when anti-Semites sought justification for their persecution of the Jews. The only issue in the New Testament itself is whether one will accept the substitutionary sacrifice of Jesus. However, Isaiah 53:10 allows us to answer who was ultimately responsible for Messiah's death. Yet it pleased Jehovah to bruise him. He has put him to grief. It was not the Jews, nor the Romans, but God himself. It was God's will to bruise Jesus, and God himself who made his soul an offering for sin. The only one able and qualified to provide salvation to the world is God. Messiah's death was not accidental, nor due to force of circumstances, but part of God's divine plan. God was pleased to allow his servant to suffer and die because this was how he was going to make atonement for the people. The fourth mockery. Now I'll actually read the scripture first. Let's go to Mark 15. Unless there's questions, you guys are quiet this morning. 15, 16 through 19. The soldiers took him away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and they called together the whole Roman cohort. They dressed him up in purple, and after twisting a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to acclaim him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They kept beating his head with a reed and spitting on him, and kneeling and bowing before him. After they had mocked him, they took the purple robe off him and put his own garments on him, and they led him out to crucify him. Having been turned over to Roman soldiers, Jesus suffered the fourth mockery of that night. Then the soldiers of the governor took Yeshua into the praetorium and gathered unto him the whole band. In Greek, the word band actually means cohort. A cohort had arrested Jesus earlier, and now it reconvened for the crucifixion. After stripping him of his clothes, they put on him a scarlet robe, thus mocking his royalty. Instead of a crown of gold, they placed a crown of thorns on his head and a reed in his right hand, to mimic a royal scepter. After spitting on him, they took the reed out of his hand and used it to strike him on the head. This was the fifth mistreatment he suffered on that night. Now, this is something that I added. I have Henry Morris King James Version Study Bible, and Henry Morris, his background is interesting. He is grew up as a evolutionist scientist, believed in evolution and all of that, and he even grew up in a Christian home. But he grew up in his youth went to college, and he believed that. And then, you know how it happens. One day he saw the truth. He realized it, and he went a 180 and went the other direction, studied the Bible. He is a genius. And Genesis, he has a commentary on Genesis that he really details the flood and what happened to the earth as a planet. In other words, like, I had somebody text me the other day asking the question of why the patriarchs lived to be so long, but then after them, the lifespan wasn't as long. Well, the answer to that is, before the flood, the earth was perfect. God created it perfectly. And there was like a filament above and something beneath that's what caused people to live for such a long time. But once the flood happened, the processes of the flood changed the earth. The middle of the earth, the fountains beneath that broke open, and the firmament in the sky broke open, and that's how they got the flood. Well, following that flood event, man did not live as long. The ages decreased gradually, but that's because of the way the earth changed. So this is Henry Morris. I took this quote. Earlier in the commentary, Arnold Fruchtenbaum talks about the curse of Adam. And let me read that to you first. Genesis 3:18 and 19. After they sinned by eating the apple, this is what God says to, I'm starting in 17, I guess. Then to Adam he said, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it, cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread, till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. That's the Adamic curse, right? So if you can imagine, before this happened, they were living in the Garden of Eden, did not have to toil or sweat or pull weeds. Everything was perfect. And then because of the curse, all these things happen. So the commentary that Henry Morris has on this, in the King James Version, verse 19 says, "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return." The curse on Adam had four main aspects. 1, sorrow, because of the futility of endless struggle against a hostile environment. 2, pain, signified by the thorns. 3, sweat or tears, the strong crying occasioned by the labor necessary to maintain life and hope. And 4, eventual physical death in spite of all his efforts, returning back to dust. But Christ, as the second Adam, has borne the curse for us. That's in Galatians 3:13. As the man of sorrows, Isaiah 53:3, wearing the thorns and suffering the greatest pain, Mark 15:17, acquired by strong crying, Hebrews 5:7, to sweat, as it were, drops of blood before being finally brought into the dust of death, Psalm 22:15. And because he so suffered for us, once again, someday God will dwell with men, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain. Indeed, there shall be no more curse. And that's Revelation 22:3. I just thought that that was wonderful how he takes this, and you can see what Jesus endured during that whole crucifixion narrative and how that matches up with Genesis 3:18 through 19. So with that, that's all I've got. Is there any questions? Next week it's going to be the actual awful thing, crucifixion.
It's been awful ahead of time. No,
Everything has been.
the violence.
Have any of you seen Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ?
Oh, yeah.
I need to. I knew it would bother me, so I never did.
I think he does a nice job of depicting it. I don't know what his spiritual status is. It's none of my business, but I think he does that one pretty well. And I just, it stood out because I heard an interview, what has that been, 20, 30 years ago? But I heard somebody interview him saying, what about that scene? That's so awful. He said, I wanted it to be awful. I want people to watch it and consider what he endured, what he went through. And he does a good job.
I think he said James Caviezel broke his shoulder or dislocated the shoulder while he was on the cross.
Yeah.
Horrible
Can
things
you
happened, even
imagine?
lightning
Yeah,
striking.
yeah.
It was unbelievable, some of the things, and everything I read
That
about
bird.
it. I thought, I don't think I can watch this, so I'll have dreams. But
Well,
I have dreams
There
anyway.
were times when I was watching and I just turned away.
Yeah, and I know Greg and I have said we have to see that. We have to see it.
And
Maybe
the
now.
genius of it is they're speaking in Aramaic.
Mhm.
And you have the
closed
This
caption.
Closed
Yeah.
caption on the bottom, so it's kind of like you have to look,
Yeah.
what's going
Well,
on.
he's making a
Right.
sequel to it now, I
Well,
hear.
his house just burned down, so we'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah.
I shouldn't laugh at that. I mean,
He's a
know.
millionaire. He can go buy another house somewhere,
Yeah, I'm
the
sure
poor
he has.
people that.
I'm
Yeah.
sure he has others, but
yeah.
Our Sunday school class saw it. We went to Buck Mills.
Did you?
Yeah, I was there to.
Oh.
What is that one?
Was that when I was with him?
Yeah.
I was thinking we saw the nativity scene, but we saw
No,
that one too.
We saw the Passion. Yeah.
The Passion.
Yeah.
Oh,
we
that's
did.
so good. I mean, it's awful, but it's good.
Yeah, I just couldn't watch it.
I know.
I mean, I had to hide my face.
Yeah.
Well, occasionally, I had just gotten to the point where it was.
But he does a good job of
Mhm.
or of Pontius Pilate's wife, how she goes out of her way to talk to Mary, Jesus' mother. Who knows if that's true, but it just shows how she was deeply concerned about what was going on. And so it could very well have been. What did you think of the Bar Abbas?
That was very intriguing.
Yeah.
I think it's
didn't-
fascinating.
I never knew that. No.
I know. I never
I've
had either.
tied those
No.
that together.
Yeah. But he said purposefully they didn't call him Yeshua in the scriptures because they didn't want to confuse people. I think that's interesting
It
too.
is. It is.
Well, it's just like in the Old Testament, when you sit there and they go, Lord, well, it's not really Lord, it's either Jehovah or
Adonai.
Adonai or Elohim, but you very
Or
rarely.
Yahweh.
Yeah.
And sometimes we overthink things, and sometimes it's very, very simple.
Oh,
Very
most of the time
simple,
it's very
yeah.
simple.
And so many things, I overthink it. I think, good grief, I have to stop and think of how things were then. Now how things are now. I have to try to think back, okay,
Do you
how,
want to set a note?
everything, how people, how women were treated, how you have to stop and think. Even Mary, I think, can you imagine?
No, I wouldn't want to. And
Oh.
she had to have some preparation.
Oh, sure.
She had to know
Mhm. There was.
that he was going to
Mhm.
suffer this.
Mhm.
That's where Buck is the one that brought me on this idea, because we were talking about the crucifixion, and could you imagine being Luke and sitting him down and interviewing Mary, because that beautiful prayer that she gives, and you're just telling Luke the story of everything. That would have been cool to sit on.
Mhm.
I can't wait for heaven when we get to see all these people.
Meet everybody.
and
I
just
can imagine
question them.
Becky's gonna get a classroom and she's gonna be sitting.
No. I'm going to sit in a classroom.
No, you're
And
gonna get
hopefully.
No.
You're just, well, you will sit in, but then you're gonna have a classroom.
No. I'm going to enjoy listening to other people. But I mean, can you imagine actually being with them, the apostles? Because I'm sure what they have written in here is just the surface. But then to hear the actual story and just really know what actually took place, I think would be fascinating.
I always think of my two uncles who had to see their brother. They were looking at him at the funeral home, and both Barney and Arch said to each other as they were looking at Ed, they go, "Oh, now he knows. He's getting everything now." And I just thought, as of being only 12 or 13, it really
Made an impression.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but they were looking over at him and saying, yeah, so much to learn.
Want this stopped or did you?
We didn't stop it.
Do you want me to stop it?
Yeah.
It's just the red button. Yeah.